Good morning, good day. My name is Nadia McConnell, and on behalf of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation and the Friends of Ukraine Network, I welcome you to this very important discussion this morning on Putin's march towards Kyiv and what can we do to deter it. We are fortunate to have with us not only participants who are working this issue 24/7, but also as our moderator, Paula Dobriansky, who has had a very illustrious 30-year career in government. Her last position was Undersecretary for Global Affairs from 2001 to 2009. And since then, she has continued her very many accomplishments in the world of academia and business. And she is always on the go. So we are very fortunate to have captured her for this morning's discussion. So Paula, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Nadia. And let me say right up front, thank you to the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. This session is extremely timely. And we're also very, very fortunate indeed because we have 4 distinguished panelists who will be addressing the issue of the Ukraine-Russia crisis. Let me say that what we are in right now, we have witnessed Russian aggression, which continues unabated. There have been reports of false flag operations, cyber attacks, increased Russian troop movement, and disinformation campaigns afoot. Now, the title of this session, let me remind everyone, is Putin's March to Kyiv. So we're going to move to our distinguished panelists, but first I'd like to introduce them, if I may. We're going to be hearing from Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, who was the former Deputy Secretary General of Nato. He also was the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, and he was a career member of the Foreign Service. And in that time, he served as U.S. Ambassador to NATO, as well as the Russian Federation, and also to the Republic of Korea. We will also be hearing from Deborah Kagan. Deborah Kagan is the Distinguished Energy Fellow at the Transatlantic Leadership Network. She also worked as a career State Department diplomat and Department of Defense official. She served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Coalition, Peacekeeping, Humanitarian, and Disaster Relief, where in fact she led a very significant coalition operation for Iraq and Afghanistan. And significantly, Debra has also served as a senior advisor consistently to US and NATO military officials. Now we're going to also be joined a little bit later, but we'll have 4 panelists. We'll be having also the Honorable Andriy Zagodornuk, who was the former Minister of Defense of Ukraine in August of 2019 to March of 2020. He also has served as an advisor to President Volodymyr Zelensky. And also he has served in a business capacity. There have been a number of businesses that he's been associated with and as the head of, particularly in the energy related field. And also we will be joined by Ambassador John Herbst. John Herbst is the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. He had 31 years as a Foreign Service officer, ending with the rank of Career Minister. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine and also to Uzbekistan. So good morning to everyone. We have a lot to cover here. And really, there is a lot to be put forward for discussion. So let me begin with you, Sandy. Maybe if you could succinctly describe for us, what is the current situation as you see it now in this Ukraine-Russia crisis? And thank you all for being here.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Paula. And thanks to the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation for organizing today's discussion. Although I do want to complain about the title. For the past 24 hours, the words Putin's march to Kyiv starts in one day have been popping up on my cell phone. And I had to keep checking. It wasn't the latest breaking news from CNN, but seriously, at some point in the next few weeks, the message may not just be the Zoom link for another webinar, but the start of hostilities by Russia against Ukraine And it does feel like we are approaching the moment of truth. Putin's military buildup continues, with more and more of the missing support capabilities and enablers beginning to fill the gaps that experts have cited in the last few weeks in trying to downplay the risks of war. Most analysts agree that by the second or third week of February, the weather conditions will be right and the capabilities will be in place to launch a large-scale invasion, which could go as far as occupying Kyiv and installing a pro-Moscow government. So the situation is quite precarious, and I also look forward to hearing from Andriy Zagodornuk on his assessment of the situation and what options Russia has and which ones it's not quite equipped to do. Now, of course, we know that displaying the capabilities for a large-scale invasion is a way to pressure Kyiv and the West to give in to Russia's demands. It doesn't mean that this is Putin's intended course of action. He could pursue a range of different, more limited scenarios, ones that would mix cyber attacks, hybrid actions like assassinations, terrorist bombings, sabotage of infrastructure, combined with a limited conventional incursion and land grab. But of course, we're all trying to puzzle this out. No one can read Putin's mind, and we have very few concrete insights into which options he's really considering, or even whether he's made the decision to use force. My sense is that Putin's still trying to determine whether he can achieve some of his objectives without the direct use of force. And that's one reason why the Russians have allowed diplomacy to continue after initially describing the week of meetings, the bilateral NATO, Russia, and OSCE meetings as a waste of time. The Normandy format is meeting again in Paris, again with low expectations of any movement. And the US and NATO will be giving their written responses to the Russian draft treaties as early as today or tomorrow. Now, I don't think these responses are going to differ significantly from what they heard from Deputy Secretary Wendy Sherman or what Lavrov heard directly from Antony Blinken last Friday in Geneva. I think the US is going to continue to urge the Russians to put aside their maximalist demands and focus on arms control and risk reduction measures such as restrictions on both sides, missile deployments, or reciprocal constraints on large-scale exercises that could at least help to de-escalate the situation. I think it's interesting, the US is also suggesting that these talks could lead to a broader dialogue, probably in the OSCE, on updating the European security arrangements agreed at the end of the Cold War. Now, that could be a bit of a minefield, but I think it is a signal that after 30 years since the end of the Cold War, we can at least discuss some of these fundamental agreements that were reached back in the early 1990s. But I fear that the Russians are likely to see all these ideas as falling short of their demands. So far, the US and NATO have been very firm in rejecting Russia's demands, which basically want to roll back history by 30 years and reduce US allies to defenseless buffer states. Diplomacy continues, but it's hard to be optimistic about the prospects for a breakthrough. But still, we shouldn't give in to fatalism or believe that war is inevitable. Deterrence is still the name of the game. And I think the US and some of the allies have actually upped their game in the last few weeks. I have in mind the increasing pace of arms deliveries to the Ukrainians by the US, but also the UK, the Baltic states, and a few other allies. Even though Germany is still the odd man out on this, I think the overall record of support for Ukraine is improving. And perhaps more importantly, this week we're seeing the US initiating the first visible steps to reinforce NATO's eastern flank with elements of the NATO response force being put on alert. And I hope that the US and other allies are going to move quickly to show before any aggression has occurred that NATO is standing by to deter and to contain any spillover. And this, I think, indirectly shows that we're prepared to continue supporting the Ukrainian armed forces. So there's been
Sandy, would
progress
you
on sanctions,
I
but I
just-
think generally the situation with the allies is better. I'll stop there.
And I apologize. I wanted to jump in because you really gave an outstanding overview, and that's terrific. And then you mentioned and segued into the question and the issue of NATO and what we're doing with NATO. So say a little bit more, as to exactly what we are, where NATO, what NATO has been saying in this context. I know Stoltenberg has delivered a number of statements. What is NATO doing? And in fact, how are we managing the alliance? Because it does matter what we do and what impact that will have, in fact, on the Russians.
Okay, well, of course, NATO, since the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, has been busy trying to do what it can to support Ukraine politically, to help them in terms of their defense reforms, training of their armed forces, cyber defense. Of course, most of the direct military support is done by the nations, not by NATO as an alliance. But I think in this particular phase of the crisis, the US has been, I think, quite effective in using NATO to bring all the allies onto a common position in opposing Russian aggression, in rejecting the Russian diplomatic proposals, and in stepping up concrete support to the Ukrainian armed forces. So the latest developments, I think, are significant because it's another step in the right direction away from what was largely trying to deter aggression by punishment after the fact. Now we're seeing some actions being taken before Russia makes its final fateful decision to shore up NATO's defenses in the Baltic states and other parts of Central and Eastern Europe. I think the French are going to send forces to Romania, for example. This doesn't directly equip the Ukrainians with additional firepower to defeat the Russians, but it's a sign that the Russians shouldn't try to widen this conflict against NATO. It can contain any spillover, which could be a higher risk during an active phase of conflict. And it demonstrates that politically that what the Russians are trying to achieve, which is to sort of reduce US role in Europe, reduce NATO's influence in Europe, is backfiring. That by engaging in this sort of direct aggression against Ukraine and trying to blackmail NATO into kind of withdrawing from Europe, it's going to have the opposite effect. They're going to be facing a stronger NATO with a larger presence on the eastern flank and greater willingness to support countries like Ukraine, like Georgia, who face this direct, even existential threat from today's Russia.
Sandy, before I go to Deborah, let me ask you one more question about this issue of alliance management. What's the situation with Germany and the various positions that the Germans have been taking here? Could you put that into context? And what can we do in this regard? Because there have been a number of reports about the Germans taking positions that, in fact, have thwarted some of the kinds of military movements that neighboring countries have wanted to execute.
Yeah, this is one of the disappointing elements of today's situation, but I wouldn't want to over dramatize it either. On weapons assistance to Ukraine, Germany continues to take a position which I think reflects the sort of lingering war guilt from World War II and the fact that German forces inflicted so much devastation on the Soviet Union that they believe it would be inappropriate for Germany to help arm Ukraine against Russia. They ignore the fact that Ukraine was perhaps a bigger victim of the Nazis than what is today the Russian Federation, but that's not neither here nor there for them. But what this has meant in practice is that they have blocked some forms of arms assistance that come from a NATO agency called the NATO Support and Procurement Agency, where consensus among allies is necessary for transactions to go forward. And they've been very stubborn on that. It's involved some meaningful capabilities like sniper rifles and some other counter and capabilities that would help with resistance against the Russian aggression. But on the whole, they've made clear they don't agree, but they're not getting in the way of national decisions by allies, which is the bulk of the military support for Ukraine. On sanctions on Nord Stream 2, Deborah can explain that. I think the differences are narrowing, but Deborah can confirm that that we're getting where we need to be in a sort of a united front on sanctions. I think we're getting there.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Deborah, you've been very patient, and I wanted to start with those issues. Let's go to you. Now, you have served as an advisor both to US and NATO military officials. Let's look at this issue of alliance management and hear your perspective. Do you agree with Sandy? And what about Germany in this mix? Do comment on the question of Nord Stream 2. Put it in perspective. And Deborah, welcome. And by the way, forgive me for 1 second. Let me mention, please, we welcome Q&A and questions from our viewers. A number of questions have come in, so please do use the chat, do use the Q&A. We welcome it and we'll look forward to it. Deborah, over to you.
Yes. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and thank you, Paula. I largely agree with Ambassador Vershbow, and I'll say there's this old saying where every time NATO's irrelevance is debated, Russia always trips over that threshold to make NATO relevant again. They can't help themselves. And so Russia proves once again, as it has multiple times over the last few decades, the relevance of NATO, because every time countries are like, well, maybe we don't have to do this, Russia does something so preposterous that all of a sudden NATO is relevant again. So I agree with Ambassador Vershbow on that. I do think there are allies who are hiding behind Germany, who are more reluctant or less reluctant to do things, and they hide behind Germany because that's convenient. We've seen this before. This morning, there were reports out of Croatia that the Croatians now are saying that if hostilities erupted, they would withdraw any Croatian forces that they have in other NATO operations and pull them back to Croatia, which I thought was very interesting because that certainly has not been their position. So this is a change. So I think Russia is having some success in splitting some allies off from each other, both in the Balkans and obviously in Germany. I want to get to a couple of things on the alliance management. I think both the United States and NATO moved too slowly. There was no reason why military action could not have been coupled with diplomacy. There's no reason why they could not have operated in parallel. And I think there was too much of a delay between the United States making decisions on for deploying forces to NATO's eastern flank, for example, too much of a delay in deciding to do operations in either freedom of navigation operations in the Black Sea, in the Baltic Sea, or even in the Mediterranean. Because what Russia is doing now goes well beyond Ukraine. And I don't mean the political thing that everyone's talking about, but you have Russians announcing exercises within Ireland's exclusive economic zones. You have the Russians doing joint exercises with Iran and China in the Mediterranean. You have Russians doing more exercises in the Black Sea and again in the South China Sea. So I think Russia is trying to project that it is a global superpower with incredible reach, especially naval reach. And this is all going on simultaneously. And I think it's also Putin daring us, meaning the United States, to say, wait a minute, we're the superpower in the room, not necessarily you. So I think that all has to be taken in context, that not only can we mass this number on Ukraine, but we can mass it all over the world in every relevant sea lane that that controls energy sources for the world. And I think that's critically important. If I
Deborah,
can just, yeah, go ahead, please.
I just a follow-up, because I'm also going to weave in, because it's active participation here from a number of our also viewers here. Daniel Rohn had asked the question, well, how do you solve the European reliance on Russian natural gas? Could you weave that in your response here? And let me also ask you, what should we be doing at this time? What has been sent? What hasn't been sent? Sandy earlier mentioned some of the steps that have been taken. Could you please comment on that? And also, I do want to welcome, we see Andriy Zagodornuk. Welcome to you, and we're going to come to you in a minute to discuss the Ukrainian piece, the view from Ukraine. But Deborah, let's hear from you.
Yeah, so the reliance on Russian natural gas is unfortunately a problem of the Europeans' own making. They could have been in a position to build better reserves. They made assumptions that a lot of people made, that that the recovery from COVID was going to be very long and slow and painful, and that's not what happened. The economic recovery happened at light speed compared to what people were talking about. For example, Ukraine has 8 storage facilities, and Andriy knows this, where they can store natural gas. You can't count as money in all of the EU space, except for some in the Baltics. There's not a lot of natural gas storage there, and so the planning did not go into this. The sort of leapfrog to green sort of overwent blue, which I call natural gas, and as a result, there was this empty space where Russia was allowed to play in, because the conversion to green and renewables didn't happen as quickly as I think a lot of Europeans were saying. And so the reliance of gas as a transition fuel, which people were saying, well, 2 years, is going to be more like 15 years or 20 years. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there a way to fix this if there's a total cutoff of Russian gas? Let me distinguish. The squeezing of gas and the limiting of what Russia is doing is mostly done on the pipelines that are related to Nord Stream 1. So that those trickling that Russia's doing, not filling up reserves, sending shipments to Asia, vice Europe, etc., signing a huge contract with India recently, it has not affected Turk Stream. The older Turk Stream, even though the new Turk Stream lines are not finished yet, it has not affected the amount of gas Russia is putting through Turkey, going into Bulgaria, elsewhere in the Balkans, especially Serbia, and into Hungary. I sarcastically refer to this as Putin's pals pipeline. And that has not been constrained as much as the UGAL and the OPAL lines from old Nord Stream 1. So that's an interesting piece, and it sort of gives lie to Putin's argument that, oh, we just don't have gas to send. They have it. It's who they're choosing to send it to and why. The third piece of this is, can the US and other countries fill those vacancies? Qatar came out yesterday and was very clear that it is at full maximum production levels, that it has financial obligations to its Asian Pacific partners on this. It is giving as much as it can. Azeri pipelines are running at full speed, as are Algerian, and it is not easy to load up LNG here and send it across the ocean quickly, and then it has to be converted. There are floating terminal facilities in Lithuania, in Croatia, 2 in Poland, but that process does not happen at the snap of a finger like some people think it does. And so there is an international squeeze of the supply of natural gas. So those shortages will not be made up in 2 minutes. It's just not. I think people are predicting things that are just not in the cards. The third thing, though, fourth thing I should say, that I think is critically important is when the US asked its European partners to take some pain here on because of Russia, to cut off this gas, the US also has to show that it's all in. in this. The US imports a significant amount of oil. Over 7% of all imports of US oil comes from Russia. And in fact, that number has gone up substantially in the past year because of the Venezuela sanctions of 2019, and Russia produces the kind of heavier, goopy crude that US uses to put through its refineries to make gasoline for the pump. And so I'll just say this, ExxonMobil and Valero, over 50% of the gas that they put through their cokers comes from Russia. So if the US is serious about having the Europeans cut off gas, the US really has to put a stop to importing Russian oil. Can they get that oil from elsewhere? Can they plus up what they get, what we get from Canada or Mexico, even from Africa, elsewhere in South America? That's something that I think the Biden administration has not looked at seriously, and I think they have to. We also import minor amounts of Russian gas because New England and New York did not build a pipeline from Pennsylvania to there. And if the Biden administration were to do a national security exemption on the Jones Act, we could easily shift US gas from the Gulf Coast to Boston Harbor. I know that's a lot, and I'll
Deborah.
leave it there.
Great. No, those were very important points. You were very comprehensive on the energy piece, and thank you for that. Andriy, welcome to you. Good to see you. I'd like to go to you. You've already been introduced earlier, thank you. But let's go right in. How do things look from Ukraine? You know, the question is, what has gotten into Ukraine? There have been statements about various requests made specifically for military hardware. Has that hardware gotten in? What's the position taken by the Ukrainian government at this time? Let's go to you. And I'm going to weave in also a few questions in a bit from some of our viewers. Andriy, let's hear from you and welcome.
Okay, so the situation in Ukraine is very strange, I have to say. It's very unusual and it's very, very strange to describe. So first of all, for a while, people did not want to believe that some apocalyptic scenarios like a full invasion or invasion of the half of the country or all east and all south are possible, and I'll explain in a minute. And then obviously they received lots of information from the press, which was itself getting it from the governments and governments from intelligence. And now there is quite a lot of concern in Kyiv and other cities about these possible scenarios. Our government is currently describing the situation as under control and taking into account that it contradicts to the statements from the Western governments. That looks a bit weird. Everything. I mean, the whole situation looks a bit weird. Our position as a center, as an analytical center, we monitor the situation like 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and so on. All news, all kind of expert opinions, any information, and so on and so on. We believe that the scenario of imminent threat, like which can be realized at any point of time, of large-scale invasion, having in mind the occupation of the whole country or half of the country, is kind of premature at the moment. However, the way Russians are preparing for that, within 1 month, that they technically could be able to start operation of that size. Now, question is whether they start or not. It's obviously a much more complex decision, and I'm very against some of the experts, including in the Western analytic centers, think tanks, who are doing, and I think, a wrong logical chain, saying if they can do, that means they will do, and they're going to win, and this is going to be the whole country. So connection of these several statements is not that obvious, because first of all, there are lots of options that they can do without going for the whole country invasion. Secondly, and which are still very unpleasant for Ukraine and generally very threatening for the European security and so on. And secondly, the attempt to invade the whole country, as it's widely, this scenario is widely discussed in the press, or half of the country, is a huge logistical effort. Which we first of all yet don't see preparation for. Secondly, if this is being prepared, this should be hundreds of thousands of personnel, and military personnel, and then personnel needed to actually keep that country under control. And in no way the outcome of this operation can be predicted by Putin. In no way he can build up a model which would tell him exactly how this is going to end and how he can control the success of that operation. So we are absolutely certain that because of the resistance of Kyiv population, because of categorical unacceptance of Ukrainians of potential Putin rule, even hypothetical, with a huge numbers compared to what we may want to expect of people ready to, and this is what independent sociology polls are showing, a huge numbers of people ready to join resistance in one way or the other, either directly or through the support. All that says that it's if Putin starts that operation, it's going to be a huge gamble. So it's basically he's responsible person, and he's like valuing his own position in Russia and generally his own image, and he's not totally crazy. He's not going to start it. Which gets us to the point that we need to look at other scenarios as well, because other scenarios may be more damaging because they're more realistic. And those include substantial hostilities in the east. Those include the potential attacks on Kyiv. Those include the blockade of the Black Sea and Sea of Azov. Those include the potential attacks in the region of Odessa. And obviously a huge hybrid campaign, which is already going, but it can only get even harder. Now, let me tell you, before I finish this sort of intro, and then I'm happy to answer a few questions, obviously. So there are certain statements I wanted to make.
Any questions?
Yeah, okay. So several statements I wanted to make. So first of all, Putin always looks at the reaction. So they never have a simple linear kind of a plan, one plan strategy. They always have a number of options. We know that by fact because we've been studying this for a while, for years now. So, and options depend on the reaction of the adversary, in this case, us. So the way we react on their potential preparations, are we scared or we are resolved? Are we preparing? Are we ready to fight? Which, yes, we are. Is the West supporting us? Is there a clear understanding that Russia will have horrible consequences if they start anything like this? So that will adapt his behavior and we need to understand that. And however ridiculous it may sound, but whether the large war is going to start or not depends to large extent from us. Because because our reaction, our attempts to preempt this, and our resolution about this is actually hugely matters. And he doesn't want to start something which he will fail with, and that's sort of hugely important. And there's been a lot of cases when they were starting some lines of effort, and then it didn't work out, and they made a step back, and they were looking elsewhere. And we do know that Ukraine and West jointly can actually stop Putin, because Putin depends economically on the West, on the global economy. He's not isolated. He's not self-sufficient. He clearly there is a military capability which Ukraine could be quickly enhanced with, which can make their occupation miserable completely. And if that is all realized, I'm sure that we can avoid disastrous scenarios, even if we have to still face some very unpleasant ones. Thank you.
Thank you. You raised a very important point. I have two more questions for you, and I see that Ambassador John Herbst has joined us. Welcome, John. We'll come to you in a moment. All of you have been introduced prior to your joining. But Andriy, let me pose two questions that I want to from our viewers. Trudy Rubin, who's of the Philadelphia Inquirer, a well-known reporter. She poses a question: isn't Putin likely to do something smaller that won't result in body bags back to Moscow and an occupation quagmire? She said something like putting missiles on Snake Island opposite Odessa, or recognizing the Donetsk and Luhansk breakaways as independent entities whose leaders can invite Russia to openly bring in troops and missiles like South Ossetia in Georgia. That's one question, but let me also add another one in the mix. We also had one from Dmitry Kosovai, who said, well, if Putin does indeed proceed to invade and occupy, how far will he go? You, in your earlier response, you were talking about scenarios. He was mostly concerned about the west of Dnipro, really going to the west of Ukraine. How far would it go, potentially? So let me go back to you, on these two questions from Trudy Rubin and from Dmitry.
Okay, thank you. So first, Trudy's question. The answer is this. First of all, there's been a number of, one question had two kind of constructs and they're very different. So one of them is that, is he capable to do different scenarios, like smaller scenarios? Absolutely. As main island is still a snake island, still a vulnerable point. We know that there are six marine, if whatever, these descent ships coming from a Baltic Sea. They're going to be here around the end of February, like second half of the February, depending on the stops they're going to make to refuel and also to put actually troops on board. Also, there are 6 ships there already. So altogether, according to our Navy experts, they say that they can put a brigade there or even 1.5 brigades. If that happens, or 2 small brigades, if that happens, they can do some amphibious operation, not in order to capture something like permanently, but to seriously distract the attention of the armed forces and create some local substantial crisis. So Meanwhile Island obviously remains a challenge, and as we described in our publications for like the last 2 years. So yes, that's also they can do Mariupol in the region of the Mariupol, and they can certainly close the Kerch Strait, and they can certainly disrupt commercial shipments to Odessa, which is a big problem. So those scenarios, absolutely. Now about Donbass, they certainly can do, and we assume this with a high probability, that the escalations in Donbass is, again, hate the word imminent, because that assumes that we know what's in Putin's head, and since he has options, nobody knows. But it's high probability. So that is does not mean that they will recognize the republics. I think recognizing republics for them, it's actually a disadvantage, because that throws away Minsk agreement completely, and that throws away their legend about that they're not there, which they're still trying to pursue with surprising, persistence. And in this case, they would say, yes, we're there, and they will not be able to push those regimes into Ukraine as a poison pill, which was always their plan. So I would say acceleration of hostilities, yes. Bringing permanent troops to those territories, absolutely, that can be the option. Recognition, that would be a huge mistake, and I don't think they're going to make this. Thank you.
Okay, John, I wanted to go to you, if I may. Thank
Please.
you. Andriy did talk very eloquently about why a proactive policy can make a difference. He stated it very clearly from where he's sitting. And this is a question I also want to ask to you, because also you, Sandy, Debra, all of you also, by the way, have been involved with the US-Ukraine Foundation and the Friends of Ukraine Network. And I want to use this as a peg because there was a terrific national security task force and a number of key recommendations that said, look, these are the kinds of actions diplomatically in terms of the military, in terms of economy, in terms of also just information and counter disinformation. These are the core steps that need to be undertaken. So it's a great report that was put out, was briefed to the Hill. Let's go to you. What are the kinds of things that can be done and should be done now? And why does a proactive policy really make a difference?
Look, we have been overly reactive in dealing with Mr. Putin's aggressive foreign policy over the past 15 years. We need to understand that the United States has unique advantages, unique superiorities, especially in conjunction with our allies, whether it's in the military sphere, the political sphere, or the economic sphere. So now we keep waiting for another shoe to drop by Mr. Putin concerning Ukraine. If we don't want that shoe to drop, if we don't want those 100,000 plus Russian forces heading into Ukraine, we should take strong actions now. One, and we're starting to do this, but not quickly enough and not strongly enough, sending serious weapon systems to Ukraine. It's no coincidence that after the president's big gaffe in his press conference last week, that they finally decided to send additional weapons now before a Russian invasion to be a real deterrence. But we know they have not sent some of the critical weapon systems the Ukrainians are asking for. We need to send that. Two, it's also no coincidence that after that gaffe, the administration is now talking about perhaps sending 8,500 American troops to strengthen the NATO presence along Russia's borders. Those troops should have been sent a month ago, because that would be a very clear indication to Putin that a new invasion of Ukraine has adverse geopolitical consequences. It would also force Kremlin military planners to worry about those troops as they consider an invasion of Ukraine. There are other things we could do as well. We could send ships into the Black Sea. We could do more military overflights of Ukraine, provide intelligence to Ukraine. We have a carrier in the Mediterranean. We can make sure that it's known that that carrier is focusing on what's happening in Ukraine. All of these things would demonstrate clear resolution from the United States. If we do that, and finally, of course, we have to stop saying publicly what we will not do with sanctions and start saying publicly what we will do. It was a mistake, a tactical mistake for us to say, well, yeah, we can't do SWIFT because our European allies are concerned. We should use the possibility of using SWIFT to make sure that there's enough steel in the spine of our European allies and partners regarding sanctions on Moscow. We do all those things, we sharply reduce the possibility of Putin sending those troops into Ukraine. Thank you.
John, if I may ask, just to follow on, because Victor Rudd, one of our viewers, he sent in a question about how much worse do matters have to become? What must happen for the West to move away from a reaction response mentality and embrace an affirmative policy calculated to turn Putin inward to address Russia's myriad domestic issues? And this includes the regional and nationalities issues that are raising their head. Would you take this kind of follow-on question, please?
It's a great question. Look, if you go back and look at the history of the Cold War, and for any of the weak need out there, let's understand that Russia under Putin over at least since his Munich statement in February of 2007, has been conducting a Cold War against the United States and the West. But if you look back at the history of the Cold War, what you see is that strong pushback against Kremlin aggression, the containment policy, was based upon smart and determined American leadership. I remember very well, I was a young diplomat, the debate in Europe about the INF deployments, how controversial that was, and Reagan proceeded. And that, of course, led to an agreement with Moscow where we both withdrew intermediate range nuclear missiles from Europe. The Biden team has said that it believes in old style American leadership in the alliance. But point of fact, they've been weak with the alliance, evident particularly in its dreadful Nord Stream 2 decision. If Biden understands that his principal objective with Moscow is not to establish a stable and predictable relationship, but to thwart Kremlin revisionism, Kremlin aggression, and he takes that approach to NATO, and he asserts traditional American leadership in NATO, our policy will become proactive. But because the administration is confused on Russia, on the one hand, its stated objective is a stable and predictable relationship, but it also understands that Moscow marching into Ukraine anew is a serious problem. If it recognizes that, again, the first priority is to stop Putin's aggressive foreign policy, everything falls into place.
All right, well, thank you for that. And Debra, I am going to ask the rest of you, in fact, and you can comment. I wanted to get Sandy to comment, and also Andriy when he comes back in here, to also look at the question about how these actions are triggering also certain countries to take positions in other directions. What do I mean? There have been reports that both Sweden and Finland are looking at becoming NATO members. So maybe let's just do a quick round around. John, just going to you on that one first, and then we'll go to Debra, Sandy, and then Andriy. John, a quick comment on that.
Look, I think that we should be highlighting in our conversations with Moscow the fact that their policies are, in fact, leading to the possibility of NATO enlargement. It's a striking fact, and this is something, again, that we should be talking about publicly too, here in the United States, that two countries which are historically known to be kind of neutral, meaning Sweden and Finland, are now talking seriously about NATO membership. And Putin's outrageous demands in those draft treaties included the concept that those two countries cannot join NATO. This highlights, again, the whole issue with those two countries highlights how damaging for Moscow's security interests their aggressive foreign policy is. And we need to, again, this should be part of our comprehensive approach to pushing back hard and, again, in a proactive manner against that policy.
All right, great. Deborah, you had a point you want to make, and I'm going to ask each of you just to comment on this piece, and then I have another question for Andriy. But please, let's have brief comments as we go around, because we have a number of things we still want to get. Deborah.
Yeah, just very quickly, the US has about 60,000 troops in Europe. All but 6,000 are west of Berlin. And so it strikes me, to build on what John was saying, it's ridiculous to sit there and twiddle our thumbs and debate whether we're going to add 8,500 and put on readiness reserve in the US when you already have forces there and you can move many of them further east. They don't have to be sitting west of Berlin all the time. So that's the first thing. The second thing on your comment is, yes, if Russia wasn't such a bully, there would not be a waiting list to get into NATO.
Okay, thank you. Sandy, would you like to just comment on the NATO piece, the ripple effect here? And then I'm going to go to Andriy on a couple of questions. Sandy.
Sure. In terms of the immediate situation, I strongly agree that we shouldn't just be putting troops on alert, but we should show, particularly if we want to deter a decision by Putin in the next few weeks to actually attack Ukraine, we should be moving the forces to Europe, shed the pretense that these are temporary or rotational, and make clear that we're going to work with our allies to adapt the posture to be much more robust, a combination of reinforcement and forward presence rather than relying only on reinforcement, which the Russians can now disrupt. But I think the broader point is also true. The more the Russians try to bully NATO and neutral countries like Finland and Sweden, the more they're increasing support for cooperation with NATO, for even membership in NATO. And we should make that clear to the Russians and show that we're ready to welcome Finland and Sweden if they choose to exercise the option, which is very important for them, to join the alliance. And I think we should look at this in a broader term. It's not just about the military. There are some questions in the Q&A. I think we need to be doing a much more aggressive job in the ideological competition, in the information space. Putin thinks we're trying to undermine his regime by supporting civil society and fomenting color revolutions, which we don't. Maybe we should be more upfront in our reaching out to civil society and our encouraging the spread of Western ideas, because it's ultimately Western ideas that Putin fears much more than he fears NATO or even the Ukrainian membership in NATO. So we shouldn't be as passive. Biden, as John said, Biden had talked about a stable and predictable relationship. I think they've dropped that rhetoric now. They realize that it takes two to tango, and Putin is not interested in stability or predictability. We should take that into account and fight fire with fire.
All right, Sandy, thank you so much. Andriy, if you'll comment on these points that the others have made, and also Lesha Schofer wrote a question. She asked, is Poland doing anything to help Ukraine? Let us also put a spotlight on what Poland has been doing in this mix. But welcome your comments on the NATO piece as well.
Yes, Russia is disrupting international order. Russia is disrupting, security environment here, and Russia is severely breaching international law and gets away with this. So they occupied Georgia and got away with that. They occupied Crimea and got away with that with very little sanctions. So essentially, they're exploiting all weaknesses of international order and law. And then particularly its very weak enforceability. And if the law cannot be enforced, it's not really working, as we know. So essentially, they know about those weaknesses very well, and they're exploiting them till the maximum. They got away with they got away with Crimea, then they started Donbass, and as you can see, especially from some of the other government statements, so many governments would rather forget about that, which opens door to them to move further on. So all countries neighboring with Russia from the European side, they all feeling, and not only from European, as you could see with Kazakhstan, they're all feeling very vulnerable right now. And Russia has a third largest budget, military budget in the world after Chinese and United States, which means that every single country in Europe is, if it's isolated, if it's by itself, if it's alone, there is no way they can match capabilities. So there is a threat, and a particular in conventional and also in the hybrid domain. So yes, I spoke to lots of Eastern European nations, Poland, including Romania, just recently been there. Spoke to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They all feel very threatened, even if they are part of NATO. So of course, the countries which are not part of NATO, they would rather become, part of the alliance so they can have a chance to defend themselves. So yes, Russian actions are provoking that response, and we will see this absolutely clearly, I think. Regarding Poland, Poland is a long supporter of Ukraine for a long time. We've been working very close with Polish government and so on. There hasn't been any particular large shipments of the weapons from Poland, as we can see from the other countries, but certainly we expect Poland to be on our side. And I know there is a lot of diplomatic work happens in Poland, so we shouldn't convince Poland that about threats. They know this very well, and particularly from Belarus side and so on. I would say that we enjoy a good understanding with Polish politicians where we are at the moment.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Let me follow up with another question that in an area we have not hit upon and has come in from one of our viewers, Anatoly Marushchak, who asked about disinformation and basically what kind of Russian disinformation narratives have been disseminated recently that have been impactful, or what is your opinion of these disinformation? So let me begin with you, Andriy, because there was this report from the UK, basically indicating that there's a coup attempt twice, months ago, and then recently a coup attempt to bring Zelensky down. Could you address the disinformation campaigns and your perspective on it? And I'd welcome others joining in.
Thank you. The coup attempt, we obviously heard about some time, and I believe that one of the reasons why British is disclosing that is to prevent by disclosure, by opening this, because obviously such things work in the case of the unexpected and very quick disruptive. I do believe that our government knows about these threats and will do whatever they can in order to kind of just decrease those risks. Disinformation works in a number of ways, of course. So the key one is that there are a number of fronts, like generally in a hybrid warfare, there are a number of fronts. There is one front is Europe, where Russians are spreading all kinds of information about Ukraine, about where the things are and so on and so on. Because as you know, there's lots of people who reading news. The question is, how do they interpret them and how do they interpret the events? Not many people actually know what Minsk agreements are, what actually happens in Crimea, what happens in Donbass and so on. So Russia plants a lot of efforts and a lot of funds actually in resources in shaping public opinion in various places. We don't have that disinformation campaign yet in Ukraine from Russia, on the scale in 2014. In 2014, it was just crazy. It was absolutely, totally insane because we have seen it was prepared very well, and people were absolutely unprotected. So it was hammering Ukrainians with all kinds of false news, and it was just unbelievable. Right now, people are much readier and much more prepared and less vulnerable. However, we still see, especially in social media, we see lots of messaging, lots of false messaging and groups and so on. So it's a whole algorithms working on this in order to spread the wrong information about where we are. I believe we still not reached the climax, even close, because we have seen an experiment, which is also Russia. There are also Russian hands in during the first days of COVID, when they are targeted a very specific population of several villages to counter the possible delivery of the quarantine people to the area, to the resort based in those villages, and the whole area just went nuts. People were like, really, I mean, this is really effective, and we have to be ready that it become. I mean, these days it's not that year. Not yet there, but we need to be ready that it may be extremely aggressive, possibly soon.
I have one question for you and then for the others, and then we're going to do a closing. And I know we may spill over just a few minutes, but, and Sandy, you raised your hand, we'll get you in there. But a fast one for you, Andriy. One question that came in, not from someone identified, but just out of curiosity, the question was, how much support does Putin have in Russia for his policies vis-a-vis Ukraine at this time?
Yeah,
do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, that's very, very interesting one, actually. Very, very good question. Well, obviously there is no answer, and also this is very dynamic. We have seen lots of people being dissatisfied with Putin, lots, and we have seen this over years. Whoever is following Russia, they understand that there's whole groups of people, which are quite dissatisfied. They will find people ready to go to Ukraine to fight. So in the case if they need like few 100,000 soldiers, they will assemble that. But what we believe that as soon as they start receiving thousands of body bags back, the popularity of Putin is going to go down extremely fast. Because what we see is that Russian public is not ready for the war. They haven't been brainwashed yet to the extent that they can justify a large war against Ukraine, where actually many of them have relatives, about the whole country. So limited operation, they always can justify. If something happens in Donbass, and God forbids, but we do assume that they may do some terrorist attack and something like staged provocation to blame Ukraine. We've been flagging this all over, just also in order to kind of, prevent it possibly by disclosing. And that's why we use every platform possible to say that, yes, this scenario is possible. So limited, they can kind of justify, but with the full scale, it would be very difficult. And it will be ununderstood war and very unpopular war for Russian citizens. And this is one of the factors which I think they have to take into account before they make any crazy decision to start. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Sandy, we know you have a hard stop. So let's go to you. If you have to pop off, you pop off. But I hope the others will stay for at least about 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes more, and our viewers will. But Sandy, you might have a point you want to comment on this, but I want to put in one other question if I can. Vladimir Sokor, he put forward a question going back to Biden's outreach to Putin last spring. He's cited the Geneva summit. His question is, did the Biden team premise its grand strategy on working out a settlement with Russia over Central Eastern Europe in order to free the Biden administration's hands to pivot against China? If you'd be willing to comment on that, and then also any other points you want to mention at this time. And thank you. We really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, no, I've enjoyed this discussion. I don't think they were looking to negotiate any kind of deal. I think there was a naive hope that if we kind of step back from a confrontational posture, we would kind of convince the Russians to accept a kind of informal truce, and that would allow us to pivot more towards dealing with China and other problems, domestic problems in particular. The problem is Putin wasn't interested. He didn't want to be parked on the back burner or to be ignored. And I think the administration has belatedly figured that out. But I did want to comment on the disinformation issue one last time. I think it's Andrey's right that the Russian people are not going to support a war with fraternal Ukraine, and but at the same time they do, I think, believe by a large majority that the U.S. is responsible for the current crisis, and so we need to do a better job in trying to penetrate the veil of Russian disinformation and make clear where we stand, and not let the Kremlin portray us as the source of the problem. And this, of course, applies to the historical narrative as well. I think the Russians have continued to make huge gains in convincing people of this false narrative of the broken promise to Gorbachev, of encircling Russia, of trying to weaken Russia in a kind of conspiracy under the veil of building a European integrated security system. And we need to do a better job in making clear that we made a huge effort to reach out to Russia. It's Putin who can't accept sovereign independent states on Russia's borders and is therefore seeking to subjugate Ukraine. And that's what's at stake. It's the future of the international liberal order. Try to kind of refute this grievance narrative that the Russians are successfully purveying, especially in Europe.
All right, well, thank you, Sandy. Deborah, let's go to you. We're going to go fast around. Do you have any other final points that you'd like to make that you hadn't made before? And if I could also stick in, there was a question in which your name was specifically mentioned. It was from Martha Caballot. And she basically asked that if there was, in fact, or is an invasion, you know, she asked the question, who would be the most important actors in the provision of humanitarian aid to Ukraine? I don't know if you want to take that on, but welcome some final points wrapping up that you may have. You know, what do we need to be focused on in the days ahead? That's going to be my core question. What do we need to worry about now as we go forward?
I really am not smart enough to answer the humanitarian aid question. I will say there was discussion in Europe this morning among the Slovaks and the Czechs and others about closing borders because they're afraid of refugees. This came up. This was in the European press early this morning, so I think that's something to keep in mind. My wrap up point would be this: just because NATO and the U.S. have a thought about how Russia's doing something and how we might react doesn't mean we have to think out loud. I think there's been a real problem of us going public and saying things like, well, our allies don't agree with us. Well, we can't do this. Well, all roads to Europe go through Berlin as opposed to through Warsaw or Prague. We have made one tactical error after another, which has led to what I like to call a strategic blunder in thinking out loud and saying, well, maybe all our allies aren't on board. I mean, these things should be done in closed rooms and having those discussions privately and then come out with this. And I think one of the biggest errors, and Sandy alluded to it as well, is as we said at the top of this, Russia is showing its political and military might globally right now. I don't think the United States, as the world's leading democracy and superpower, should ever say publicly, we can't walk and chew gum at the same time, meaning we cannot handle China at the same time we handle Russia, so we want Russia to go away. I don't think the United States of America should ever suggest to any of its enemies, these are not strategic competitors, they're enemies, and as I like to say, enemies get a vote. You don't say to Russia, I can't handle multiple things in multiple theaters. So therefore, we want you to, as Sandy said, park yourself so we can handle China. So I think that is just a huge strategic blunder. The United States is quite capable, and you should never suggest to your enemies that you're anything less than that. And I think we've done that time and time again over the last 6 months.
All right, thank you. I see Nadia is back in, and Nadia, I hope you don't mind. I want to give, before we close and before I turn it to you, maybe to wrap, let me give John a chance to give any final comments that he would like to make in what we should be focused on and going forward, and same with Andriy. But I am going to ask John. I'm glad, by the way, Deborah, Deborah, you did address a question that came in from Roma Haida, because she asked about, are any borders with neighboring EU's countries closed? And you referenced that, so I'm glad you did. But John, as you close and give your final quick words, I want to weave one other question that came in, and that was about from Andrea Spindle, because she asked about the Jewish community and the rise of anti-Semitism during this period. So please close, give your points, and is anything like that happening in Ukraine today?
Well, on the question,
John, and then we go to Andriy.
On the question of anti-Semitism in Ukraine, of course, if you go back 150, 200 years, it was a serious issue. But in post-independence Ukraine, anti-Semitism is a very small problem. And Pew polls showed a couple of years ago that anti-Semitism in Ukraine was the lowest in Europe. So again, there are some issues there, but they're compared to most other countries, they're not bad at all. Not to say we shouldn't still pay attention to it. Final closing comment. Deborah said most what I wanted to say. I'm a huge fan of Sandy Vershbow, and I hope that he's right that the administration has walked away from the goal of stable and predictable relationship with Moscow. But I'm sorry to say that as recently as early January, Blinken said again that that was our objective with Moscow. And there's great confusion if that's our objective, when in fact what we're trying to do is prevent a Russian new invasion of Ukraine. Thanks.
All right, thank you. And thank you for being so pithy. Andriy, you get the last wrap-up comment. What do you want to share with our viewers, the view from Ukraine? And I'm going to stick in one other question that came in about Turkey. What's been Turkey's position? We had a question on Poland. Just if you'd answer that first and then give your wrap-up.
Turkey always plays its own game, and Turkey is always have a one. They want to have a kind of a balanced position. They are not friends of Russia. They obviously want to keep relations with Russia, but if they need to shut down the Russian plane, they will do this, and they have done that before. So they are very they're not afraid of Russia like many other countries in the region, and that's what makes them quite unique. They numerous times they suggested to be an intermediary in this process, but Russians always declined because they don't want actually to be an effective intermediary in that process. And so they are playing, basically they offer us help. They did offer us some capabilities which were either substantial game changers, at least in optics, not necessarily in a real yet situation, but optically they were game changers. So they are, we don't feel that like they are a cold partner or they are like walking away from us or anything like this. But Turkey has to be worked out. So it's a tough subject, and we need to work with them. But we currently enjoy on communication perspective. It's positive. It's very positive, and the trends and the general opinion is okay. But it's complex. So regarding the anti-Semitism, I wanted to comment. I haven't heard of any issues of that type anywhere in the news or anywhere in the information space. There are always idiots in Ukraine, including, so that an individual level that may happen, but I don't think it's a systemic problem. The fact that we have so many politicians, including the current president and including the other top politicians which are ethnically Jewish, says that there is no rejection of ethnical Jewish people in the Ukrainian society. So I don't think we have a systemic problem of that type. On the wrap-up comments, I would still reiterate: look, it hugely depends on the reactions of those first movements of Russia, what the next movements will be. So the way we react, what we do proactively, actually defines to a great extent how Russia will do, because they're scared to be weak. They're scared to look weak. And in Ukrainian internet, there's a picture now sent from people, which I wanted to say, is that like somebody asks like where Russian borders end, and the answer is where the asses got kicked. So that's basically, as soon as they see the resistance, as soon as they see a firm reaction, a firm sort of resistance and rejection, they're not going to move on. So it's literally not a lost case. we can actually preclude them from and forbid them from making horrible mistakes and move this. So and I really thank for United States for support, because obviously this is huge. Thank you very much.
Let me thank you. Let me thank the panelists, our distinguished panelists. Outstanding commentary. I also want to thank our viewers. Great questions. You really kept me busy and the team busy. And Nadia, back to you for final closing. But congratulations to you, the US-Ukraine Foundation, and also a hearty congratulations. You guys, last December, you had the Foundation's National Security Task Force report. You had all the actions that needed to be taken, and we're discussing all of those today. Just well done. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Paula, again for moderating a very, I would say, strategic and excellent conversation. Regarding the Friends of Ukraine Network, that is only possible through the generosity of Friends of Ukraine in numerous institutions. I have to single out the Atlantic Council, and of course, John, in addition to his full-time job as director of the Eurasia Center, has been chairing the National Security Task Force. And that has been a major key to success. And also the fact that it brings people from other institutions, Institute of Peace, wherever they are, the Friends of Ukraine have come together. And I would just say to any of our friends watching in Ukraine that they should know that in addition to all the other efforts, there is this joint, ongoing, very proactive effort to support Ukraine by very senior diplomats and friends such as Ambassador Herbst, Ambassador Vershbow, and Paula. You, even though you're not formally part of the Ukraine of the network, you're always there. So we have actually other people who are not necessarily formally listed who are working very actively 24/7, and I think that should bring some level of, I guess, I would say confidence. And also our now working together with people like Andriy Zagodornuk, so that we bring together the two sides and we really are informed and able to pursue and promote what we think are the best policies in support of both of our countries. So again, I want to thank everybody in the initiative who are so generous with their time. And John, I have to really single you out for the leadership you've provided since, I guess, formally 2014, I guess it's been. So again, and Paula, thank you. You know, when I first contacted you, I have to tell you, your schedule is so full. I think I contacted you a couple of months ago. We were going to be discussing the third working group on democracy, but of course, events have overtaken, and so we had to pivot. But okay, I think I'm hearing Robert to say to stop. So thank you again, and
right, we do need to wrap, but a final, but before we do, with our distinguished panelists on, a final point, there was a Q&A that came in that asked if the webinar will be shown again, is this recording? So you might want to consider that. I don't know if you know the answer to that, Nadia.
Yes,
is the answer yes?
We always record, and it will be posted on the website.
Outstanding. Hey, thank you all, and Nadia, well done, and thank our viewers.
Thank you.
Bye all. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.